when the first plane goes to Rwanda, when the first serious number of Albanians are returned, that is when suddenly there are question marks. Is it worth paying a human trafficking agent for this?
Right.
Radio. Let's carry on with that windfall tax conversation we were just hearing about from Steve Swinford. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt planning to extend windfall taxes on oil and gas companies to raise an estimated £40 billion over the next 5 years. Well, this is inevitable. I mean, it felt like Liz Truss sort of disagreed with this on ideological grounds, but it seems like the obvious place to go at the beginning when you've got to find money from somewhere.
God, how, Truss and Kwarteng have really done us a disservice, haven't they? I mean, people are talking, I like the correspondent who said he was old enough to remember the Truss government, but the extraordinary political amnesia. I mean, actually, the point about the mini budget is in itself, it constrains the government's wiggle room because, it's going to be much, much harder to borrow, which inevitably there'll have to be a borrowing component. The very idea that they're discussing, I mean, the old adage in politics is follow the money. The idea of abolishing the referendum requirement on local authorities is like following the lack of money. Yeah. It's an extraordinary way to confess to political weakness. I wonder who leaked that one. And I think it's going to have to be a bit of everything. It's going to have to be cleaving to this windfall tax. There's going to have to be some more tax rises, and of course there's going to have to be cuts. Who knew?
Exactly. Well, and what do you make of this? What did you think of the mini budget? Because that was a mini budget big on conservative ideology that sort of fell apart immediately. What was your reaction when you first saw it? And do you agree with Will that effectively those decisions that were made there are still hampering the government, even though they've U-turned on it completely?
Well, I think they're only playing now a very minor role. The thing that went wrong with the mini budget was that it was everything all at once, and apparently without consultation beforehand, without talking to the Office of Budget Responsibility, without squaring the banks, just all rushing in. Now, I was for every single measure in it, but over time, not just boom. But nevertheless, the IMF did say that it would have guaranteed us the highest rate of growth in the G7 if we'd done it, but it would have brought a lot of other problems as well. We've got a perfect storm at the moment. We had COVID, during which time the economy virtually shut down and we were spending vast sums of money to keep people at home. We've got the war in Ukraine, which is causing shortages and a huge rise in prices. Now, of course, we had the fallout from the mini budget, and I don't envy Rishi Sunak his job. But this began with a discussion about a windfall tax. That's fair enough as a short-term measure. You can't deter investment forever. But he's still going to have a massive hole. And I'm concerned about one thing, which is that help should be targeted. Now, when you talk about, for example, the triple lock and the rate at which pensions go up, for some people, the state pension is either all or virtually all of their retirement income. For other people, like me, for example, I'm 3/4 of a century old. I'm a pensioner. For others like me, it's a very small part. But everybody is going to get the same level of help. Yeah. Everybody is going to benefit from government assistance for energy. Everybody's going to benefit from an increased winter fuel allowance. And it's not targeted. And there are people who desperately need it.
But can they do the targeting? And you know this from government, that targeting is a really good idea, but it takes time and expertise and money. And sometimes they think the best way of getting money to the poorest people is chucking it at everyone.
That is indeed always the argument. Targeting is administratively terribly heavy. And you have to put a lot of resources into actually implementing it. But once you've implemented it and you've got the system going, it does run itself. And my concern is that simply, throwing it at everybody at a time of severe restraint is not going to help those who need it most. I buy into the targeting argument. Good heavens, I've made it myself sometimes in government. I've made it, stood at the dispatch box and made it. But nevertheless, the fact is that some people are going to suffer more than others, and any sensible government should be aiming the money where it's most needed.
Well, just before we move off this topic, do you think we are heading to sort of austerity 2.0? That it's amazing how Liz Truss stood there and said, no, and Boris Johnson before her, actually, no more austerity. And yet now, when they're looking at the sums, it feels that that is the only answer, or at least half of the answer to the government.
I don't believe it is the only answer. I think Liz was quite right to focus on growth. As I've already said, I think the way it was done was appalling. But I think she was quite right to focus on growth and to say that is where ultimately an economy recovers. It recovers through growth. And that's what she needs. And we do need to attract people to come here. We do need to give incentives to enterprise. One of the big balancing acts Rishi's going to have to consider is fine. You know, everybody wants to tax companies and all the rest of it. But at what point do you deter enterprise when in fact you should be incentivizing it? There's an awful lot of balancing there to do. But are we in for a tough time? Yes.
Will, do you think they'll be able to sell another round of austerity, having really walked back from it so often in previous years?
It's not clear what's going to happen exactly, but sooner or later the Conservatives have been in power far too long. I mean, unfortunately, Labour's ideas are pretty impoverished as well. But it's extraordinary the schizophrenia of these successive administrations, as on the one hand they desperately prate on about growth, and on the other hand they try and kind of fight this apparent tsunami, according to them, of illegal migration, and of try and kind of, you know, they want the right people in to grow the economy because, you know, the fact of the matter is we have a very aging population, as this panel would demonstrate. Both Anne and myself, you know, are kind of are older, and I think that something's got to give here. There will be austerity, unquestionably. It's not austerity 2.0 or whatever it is. Austerity never ended. There's lots of government departments, lots of things that just haven't, you know, had enough cash to sustain them anyway. So we're in sort of pole position for a nasty recession, I'd say.
Oh, right. Goodness me. We're going to talk about migration in a second. I just want to break off for a minute. Just some news here. The Standards Committee has recommended that the Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen should be suspended from the Commons for 5 sitting days. This is for a breach of the rules. And we'll get the latest on that from Matt Chorley before 9:30. So let's move on and talk about migration. It's dominated the news for most of the week. The latest incident being that a group of migrants were mistakenly taken from Kent and stranded in central London, cold, hungry and without any accommodation. About 40 migrants were removed from Manston, the overcrowded processing centre that we all know about now, so they could stay with family and friends. 11 of them, however, had nowhere to go. Ann Widdecombe, we've had a succession of government ministers on this week saying we really need to grip this problem. And of course, many people are saying, well, of course you do. You're the government. Why haven't you gripped it already? What is your reading of what has gone wrong?
This has been going on for decades, and I use that word advisedly. In 1999, I proposed that we should send out a deterrent message, because the message that goes out is that once you get into Britain, you're very, very unlikely ever to be removed. We don't have national identity cards. We do have a flourishing underground economy, and we don't have a quick processing system. So people just get lost in the economy. And that is the way it's worked for a very long time. And so the message that goes out is come to Britain. And if you do manage to get in, you're very unlikely ever to have to leave. The message I wanted to send out, and successive people after me, Home Secretaries and Shadow Home Secretaries, have wanted to send out, is if you come to Britain with a false claim, you will be detained, you'll be dealt with quickly, you'll be sent home. And so I proposed 20 years ago, that we detained all new asylum seekers in secure reception centres while we processed their claims, so that those we wanted to accept, we could deal with very quickly and they weren't clogged up in some queue. And those we didn't want to accept, we could return. But finally, one of the big problems is returning. It's actually, you can say this person isn't entitled to asylum, but returning them is then a logistical nightmare.
But so that's always been the case. So how can you fix that particular problem then, returning?
You can only do it. I mean, we were supposed to have an agreement with Albania, for example, that we could just return their nationals if we were rejecting them. You have to get countries to accept that people are their nationals. But we know exactly where these people came from. They came from France. And it's not as if we don't know, which is the big problem at Heathrow, where people will stay airside for a day sometimes, then present at the immigration desk, say they've come from a country which has got a record of persecution. They haven't. But the people coming across the channel, we do know where they last were, which was in a perfectly safe country, which was France. And we've got to be far tougher than we have been. But when the first plane goes to Rwanda, when the first serious number of Albanians are returned, that is when suddenly there are question marks. Is it worth paying a human trafficking agent for this?
Right. So you think Rwanda will be a deterrent if it happens?
When it happens, if it happens, when it happens. Yeah, I'm not holding my breath.
Will Self, do you believe in this idea of that we should be sending out more of a deterrent message?
I just don't think it's practicable. You know, the global South sense and knows that the global North, and in particular Europe, remains a relatively wealthy part of the world. You know, where many of the countries in Western Europe are failing to be sufficiently philoprogenitive to replace their own population, which is doubtless a source of annoyance to Ann Widdecombe. And under such circumstances, there's going to be a constant battle by aging wealthy people to keep poor young people out. It's not a very edifying spectacle, is it? And the government's kind of messaging, as I say, it's kind of schizophrenic. On the one hand, they want growth, they want dynamism, they want all the attributes of young, frankly, poor people who are hungry for more. And on the other hand, they behave like an aging person. You know, I often think of it living on sort of Daily Mail hate island, who only has access, who cares only about their property rights. So it's an unedifying spectacle. The way the government messages around it, though, is pretty repulsive. The elephant in the room, of course, remains Brexit. It's made it far harder to deal with all of these issues than it was heretofore. Just another thing that the Brexiteers promised that hasn't been delivered on spectacularly.
Well, I'm just okay. Anne, go on.
Yeah, well, as somebody who was right in the thick of the Brexit campaign, we never said that this was a way of halting illegal migration. That obviously needed its own measures. What we said, this is a way of controlling, not closing, but controlling our borders so that we can say who comes here, on what terms, with what benefits. We can say that. Now, that is a way of addressing the point that Will is making, and it's not an invalid one. You know, we do need more skills in the population, and that is a way of getting it. But simply to have open borders, which is what we were obliged to have during Brexit, means that we can't even control the legal immigration, let alone the illegal stuff. They're two completely different issues. And what's happening on the channel at the moment is not the product of Brexit, it's the product of a lack of will through successive governments.
Let's finish up on accents, because it's an interesting subject we've also mentioned today. Almost half of UK workers have had their accents mocked, criticised or singled out in a social setting. A survey suggests the Sutton Trust found 46% of workers have faced jibes about their accents, with 25% reporting jokes at work. I think Birmingham scored particularly badly. Scottish scored quite highly. Will Self, I don't think they tested for languorous drawl, but if they had it, I'm sure people would have been very fond of that.
Yes, I mean, languorous drawl does attract a certain amount of opprobrium, I have to say. People can be very dismissive. They can try, they get slower and slower when they're talking to you. Sometimes they fall asleep, which is clearly intensely disrespectful. I don't know. I was slightly shocked by this item. It seemed to me an example of extreme thin-skinnedness on the part of the English. I wonder, you know, in what such mockery really consisted. I mean, speaking as somebody who is, you know...
Go on, we'll carry on.
Well, speaking as somebody who's obviously got a ridiculous accent and is frequently mocked for it. Often small children follow me down the street speaking in my own lugubrious tone.
And also, do you think that's right? Because we were saying before, are people entitled to have aesthetic preferences for accents they like and they don't like? Maybe not everything needs to be a sort of protected property of someone.
Well, quite. I mean, virtually the only thing that Will said that I agree with is the bit about thin-skinism. I mean, really, half this mocking is affectionate. I've been mocked for my accent. I say calculator. Now, some people hear that as calculator. And I once worked for Unilever, and all my colleagues were going around saying, "Oh, Anne's just getting out her calculator." Now, I thought it was funny. And I still think that there should be plenty of room for joshing and affectionate mockery. And I just do hope that people aren't now going to take this seriously. Otherwise, we're going to have a woke campaign about accents.
Oh, that word, the W word. We almost got through the entire panel without using the word. And I must ask you about Matt Hancock going on I'm a Celebrity. Do you think he's worth £400,000? And do you have any advice for him?
My advice for him should be he shouldn't have done it. He's taking out weeks. Well, he may be eliminated early, but potentially he's taking weeks out. It's not recess, it's full session. So he's not doing the one thing he's paid for, which is voting. And how his constituents can cope if there's an emergency when the MPs, adrift in a jungle somewhere. I just can't imagine. And I think I think what he's doing is wrong. I mean, I know we're all meant to be laughing and mocking and, taking the mickey, but I actually think what he's doing is wrong. When I was an MP, I refused all intensive reality shows until I'd retired. Then it was fine, and I had no duty to anybody. He does, and he's not discharging it.
Will, do you want to take the mickey at all, just for balance? Anne's given the moral reason.
Politics is show business for ugly people, but increasingly show business is show business for ugly people. As Hancock is demonstrating, he should be removed from the Queensland jungle to Nauru, the island where asylum seekers are processed into Australia. And from there, he should be returned to Britain, his country of origin. Anne would approve.
I think we could all agree on that. We've stumbled into agreement at the end there. Lovely to speak to you both. Thank you for joining us this morning. That's the former Tory Minister Ann Widdecombe and the writer Will Self together.